right, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you all here. Whoever spoke to the secretaries about my spring...
Yes, 5,000 people.
In the spring, my class on women leaders will be at 4 o'clock on Tuesdays. So thank you to whoever spoke up. Okay, great. You got some weight there. So today we're talking about the British generals. This will be the only time, of course, I have more than one character to talk about. I was going to choose just one. I was going to do Cornwallis, but unfortunately I just don't have enough in my personal library to cover a whole the amount of time that I needed. So I thought it would be good to do the main generals instead. Now, but of course, before I do that, I have to tell you what I forgot about Benedict Arnold. And I was kind of surprised because I was going to make a thing out of this, but I forgot to tell you what happened at his second court-martial. So he was court-martialed because of his dirty dealings as the military governor of Philadelphia. And the result of that, after several months of delays, he was found guilty on a lesser charge of mismanagement, and his the verdict was that he was going to, or the sentence was that he was going to get a reprimand from George Washington, and that was it. So Washington wrote up his reprimand, and he tried to make it, as mild as he could, and gave it to him. But he also gave him another letter in addition to the reprimand, in a sense almost saying how sorry he was that he had to do that. Of course, that still ruffled Benedict Arnold's feathers, and he didn't care for that too much. But that was kind of the end result of that court-martial. So, the British generals, the main British generals, and I actually had to leave one of them off. I left Burgoyne off because I talked a lot about him last week with Benedict Arnold, so I didn't want to have to do 5 of them this time. I did want to say one thing about Burgoyne that I didn't before. When I first talked about him, when I first introduced him last week, I called him Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, because that was kind of a nickname that he had. The nickname came from his soldiers, not from his friends in England. They called him Gentleman Johnny because he actually sincerely cared about his soldiers. He was appalled at the treatment that some soldiers received in the British Army, and he actually wrote a treatise or a pamphlet against corporal punishment, that it was wrong to whip or beat soldiers for their misbehaviors. And that was way ahead of his time. As we know, soldiers were whipped and beaten for many years after this point, but he was sincerely cared about his soldiers. So that was Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. So the British generals, one of the things that I'd like to emphasize today is that the popular perception of British generals is oftentimes wrong. And what I want to bring out is, first of all, the connections that many of these generals had to the colonies, and many of them felt a real kinship and sympathy for the colonists. They were not just arrogant aristocrats coming to punish the local yokels for whom they had no respect. Many of them had real ties and connections and friends in the colonies. So, the bibliography. I don't often put books on here that I don't recommend, but here's one. Carolyn Tiger, I like that name, General Howe's dog. I found this somewhere in a used bookstore or something. I thought, wow, this should be really fun to read. It's a short book. General Howe's dog. Anybody who knows anything about the generals back in those days, and gentlemen in general, knows that they often loved hunting with their dogs. And some of them were just obsessed with caring for their dogs. Burgoyne was one too. He loved his dogs and often would say that he enjoyed them more than any of his human friends. But this book was about a minor incident during one of the battles. General Howe, his dog ran away and was found by American soldiers. And when Washington found out about it, he sent the dog back with a note. A general, we found your dog, we just wanted to return your dog. Very simple thing. And she wanted to make a whole book out of this. But in fact, she didn't. This is kind of a bait and switch thing, where she wrote this 162 pages. There's one chapter in it about this little incident that amounts to nothing more than what I just told you. And yet the rest of it is really kind of an overview of the Revolutionary War. So it's not that it's a badly written book. It's just that I was very disappointed not finding something really interesting about how generals treated their dogs and how they loved their dogs and other funny little incidents that might be amusing. So if you want to read a general overview of the Revolutionary War, that's kind of what this does, with this little incident thrown into it. Anyway, Sir Henry Clinton.
Was for students?
Huh?
Was it for students?
No, I found it in I don't know if I found it, I probably didn't buy it new, because I rarely do that, but I probably found it in some used bookstore and thought, wow, this sounds like it'd be really fun to read. And yeah. So some of the British generals and generals would write their apology after the war, justifying what they did. Henry Clinton wrote a good-sized book about the war, and so it's not easy reading, but it has some really good insights into what he was thinking through the war. And this is not just his story of the war, it's also many letters and other things thrown in as well. One of the best single-volume histories of the Revolutionary War, Robert Middlecoff, The Glorious Cause. I think that was published back in the 80s. It's a very good book, and it is a standard now that many historians will tell you it's one of the best. Now, if you are more ambitious, Page Smith, A New Age Now Begins, 2 volumes. This is the first 2 volumes of his 8-volume History of the United States. And I just enjoy his writing. He has a narrative style that's pretty easy to read, very informative. These 2 volumes run to almost 2,000 pages, so be prepared. But he's a good read. I really enjoy his style of writing. Very, 2,000 pages, he's going to tell you an awful lot. So we're starting with General Thomas Gage, born March 10th, 1719, entered the army 1741. He fought in the wars of the day, the War of Austrian Succession, the Jacobite Rebellion, Battle of Culloden, where Bonnie Prince Charlie made his last stand. And then he was the governor of Montreal. He fought in the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. He became the commander-in-chief of all the British forces in North America. And married to Margaret Kimball of New Jersey. He married a colonist. So again, many of these British generals had close ties to the colonies. He was not a foreigner in any sense. So there's Thomas Gage and Margaret Gage. So the events of the colonists leading up to the war, like many in Great Britain, he thought the uprisings in 1765, the Stamp Act, was a group of agitators just making trouble for the British Crown and the more or less ignorant populace following them. And if we just dealt with them, it would blow over in no time. 1768, we'll probably have to send some troops now to quell the uprising, mostly in Boston, of course. But a couple of regiments will do the trick, and we'll be done with that. 1772, he's looking at the democracy in the colonies and thinking that's probably not a good thing. They get to vote on too many issues, and they've gotten a bit puffed up. Boston Tea Party was a big event. Many people, as I said before, both in Britain and in the colonies, were outraged at that, said that was too far, the colonists shouldn't have done that. He happened to be in England at the time, and it was decided that Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts wasn't doing enough to keep them in line, so he was going to be the military governor. And he arrived in May of 1774, and he was told by King George to be conciliatory. You don't need to drop the hammer on them. You don't need to be harsh, but you need to be strict enough to let them know who's in charge. So he travels to Boston. He actually had a fairly warm reception when he got to Boston. Paul Revere, Joseph Warren met him. They had the flags waving and greeted him very politely when he got there. And they actually, that evening, they had dinner together. And one of the things that didn't go over too well, this crowd of people, so Gage, they're all drinking toast. That's kind of a common thing. You have a dinner, everybody has to propose a toast. And he proposed a toast to Thomas Hutchinson, and all he got was a bunch of hisses and boos. But anyway, so he became the military governor, and the Bostonians were not going to cooperate. One of the things that is a popular misconception about the Quartering Act, in schools all across the United States, the teachers tell their kids that the Quartering Act forced the British soldiers, or forced people to allow British soldiers to sleep in their homes. And so that's how all these British soldiers became so unpopular. Everybody had to have British soldiers in their homes. That was not the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act stated that the colonists had to pay for their quartering, but they were to build barracks for that purpose. They did not have to have them in their homes, except for certain officers who did have, who would spend their time in homes, but that was usually not forced. That was allowed, and they get paid for it too. So the Bostonians were telling Gage, basically, we're not going to build the barracks. The lumber guys out in the forest were not going to cut wood. The carpenters heard about that in town and said, well, if they're not going to supply us with wood, we can't build anything. So they just camped on the commons. And Gage did not force the issue. There wasn't much he felt he could do short of start arresting people, and that wasn't going to happen anyway. But the Assembly at this point was starting to elect delegates to the Continental Congress, and he couldn't allow that, so he dissolved the Assembly. He did want to strictly enforce the port bill and not allow ships into the harbor for trade. Smaller boats were allowed for food, and so that was allowed, although they did kind of harass them somewhat. He tried to bribe some of the patriots, most notably Samuel Adams, which didn't go far at all, but he did succeed in bribing Benjamin Church. Here's a little map I found that looked kind of nice. Boston, 1770. Here's the Commons. The town proper is over on this side, and the Boston Harbor over here. And the soldiers basically had to camp out on the Commons. So, Lexington and Concord, we all know, April 19, 1775. A great shock to pretty much everybody concerned. Both the British and the Americans could hardly believe that the colonists could do this. 273 British casualties and only 93 American. It's worth noting, though, that this was going to happen. George III was sending more and more troops all the time. He knew that war was going to break out. It was expected. The reinforcements arrived in May, just the following month. They were on the way when Lexington and Concord broke out. 3 generals, William Howe, Johnny Burgoyne, and Sir Henry Clinton, were on the ships that arrived, and to their shock, they found out that the war had already started. Battle of Bunker Hill. And for those of you who like to correct people all the time, whenever you hear Bunker Hill, you say, no, it's not Bunker Hill. It was Breed's Hill. The confusion happened at the time. The colonists who were reinforcing Charleston Heights, they weren't really sure which hill was which. And they said, just go to the farthest one. Is that Bunker Hill? Fine, Bunker Hill, go reinforce that one. And so it was very hastily done. The British knew that they should have taken it earlier, right after the Lexington and Concord. But they knew now that they had to take it. It's the heights overlooking Boston. They can't allow the colonists to take it because if they had cannons up there, they have a clear shot at Boston, which would really ruin their chances of staying at all. So, Clinton actually had a good plan. Charleston Neck, the whole Charleston Peninsula, could have been very easily taken. And he said, look, all we need to do is send some troops on this side and send some on the other side. We'd have them surrounded. We could catch them and roll them right up, no trouble. And if Gage would have taken his advice, it would have been a very simple affair and a complete disaster for the colonists. But Gage, and then actually Howe, who he had sent to do this operation, said, look, they're just colonists. They're not trained soldiers like we have, and it'll be fairly easy. They have their entrenchments up there on top of the hill and down the other side. We'll just march in there, and they'll run away as soon as we start, coming in earnest. And of course, that didn't happen. For a number of reasons, the British just really took them too lightly. The Americans should have been very easily defeated and rolled up, but they weren't. So here's Bunker Hill, and General Clinton, his idea originally said, look, here's the fortifications at the top of this hill, Breed's Hill, and then down the other side. If we land over here, and here's an interesting little footnote for you. right about here was a Jewish cemetery. I thought, really? When I read that, I thought, wow, there's enough Jewish people there to have a cemetery. So yeah, there's a Jewish cemetery here. He said, if we land some troops here, land some on this side, we can roll them up, we have them in a pincer, and there'll be no trouble. And that's what they should have done. But William Howe, who was set to do this, said, no, they're just colonists. They can't stand up against His Majesty's forces. So it was a straight-on attack. The troops were landed here, and they marched right into entrenched positions that they found out, to their great loss, was a big mistake. It took 3 times, 3 charges, each very disastrous. The 3rd time, the only reason they did take it was because the colonists had run out of ammunition. If the colonists were a little bit more organized, and they were terribly disorganized, the 3rd one would have failed as well. And it could have been an even greater disaster. But they ran out of ammunition, so they had to fall back. And the British captured Bunker Hill, but of course it was a Pyrrhic victory. Lost 1,000 soldiers and officers. Here's some artist's rendering. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I kind of like the picture, so I put it in there. As it turns out, the top of the hill, Breed's Hill, was not that well fortified. It was on the side that was really better fortified, and they actually sent more troops around to the side, to the right, in the more well-entrenched positions, and that's where a lot of them got wiped out. And here's Charleston here burning because of the cannonading that was done. And the reactions. General Gage, these people show a spirit and conduct against us they never showed against the French. And he knew, because he fought in the French and Indian War, as many of these generals did. And I like this quote, Clinton, another such victory would ruin us. The Americans actually were quite dispirited. This was a loss as they saw it. They were kicked off of the hill, and so they thought, wow, this is lousy. We should have kept that. And it wasn't until much later that they realized it was, in some ways, a victory. And after that, General Gage was relieved of command, and General Howe, the guy who had this battle, who truly messed up the battle, was now the guy in charge. Yeah. So General Howe replaces him in September 1775. He was actually the youngest of 3 brothers who were all well known to the colonists. His oldest brother, George, was a real hero in Massachusetts. He had died in the French and Indian War, and Massachusetts actually paid for a memorial at Westminster Abbey in England because he was such a great hero to them. He's the type of guy who, although he was a general, he liked to dress in the buckskin suits, and he liked to know what the common soldiers did, and they loved him for it. One of the guys on Bunker Hill who helped organize the resistance, Israel Putnam, he was with George Howe in the French and Indian War, and he was warning him not to expose himself so much to fire. And well, he was shot, and he died in the arms of Israel Putnam, who later now is fighting against his brother at Bunker Hill. And Richard Howe, the other older brother, was an admiral, the admiral, in the British Navy. So William Howe, born 1729, also fought in the War of Austrian Succession. He was a hero in the French and Indian War. And once he took charge in Boston, many were telling him, the other generals there, Boston is a dead end. We need to get the military out of here, get the army, and go to New York. That's a more central location. It's a better place for us to send troops out from, and we can control a greater area. We are bottled up here in Boston and doing nothing. But he didn't take their advice. Instead, he stayed in Boston, and some people say it was because of this cutie right here. There was actually a cartoon made of this that I thought was kind of interesting. And there was, here we are. There was a poem or a song to the tune of Yankee Doodle Dandy that was made about an incident, and one of the stanzas includes William Howe and his mistress. I'm going to read this for you. Sir William he, snug as a flea, lay in bed a-snoring. He does no harm as he lays warm in bed with Mrs. Loring. So it was well known. Nobody, historians will tell you we're not sure that they were having an affair, but it was kind of obvious they were together a lot and very cutesy together. And her husband, Joshua Loring, got a very good job. The commissary of prisoners, one of those jobs that you don't have to do a lot of work if you don't want to, and nobody's going to call you on it. And so she spent a lot of time with General Howe, but eventually she left for England right about the time he was released. But she went back with her husband and had three more children after this. So, whatever the truth of the relationship was, it was widely seen as an affair that was ultimately let go, and she went back to her husband. And apparently he acquiesced in all of this as well, because he got a really nice job. So, Boston. They spent the winter in Boston doing nothing. Well, maybe he was doing something, but the soldiers weren't doing anything. Nothing productive. So, as we know, Henry Knox goes up and gets the cannons from Ticonderoga, arrives in January, and they place them on Dorchester Heights. And it's one of these great scenes that the Americans could do something that the British were absolutely astonished at, and that was digging trenches and building emplacements on Dorchester Heights. So here's a famous painting of the cannons being brought through the snow, through the winter, from Ticonderoga. That is something like 300 miles on sleds. And here's Boston, and here's Dorchester Heights, and this is where they emplaced the cannons. But they had to do it quickly because the British were well aware that Dorchester was kind of their vulnerability. They knew that if the Americans put cannons up there, they would be in deep trouble. But for some reason, they didn't send troops out there themselves to take it. Maybe they felt they couldn't hold it. But in any case, they were watching it. They knew that they couldn't let the Americans get that. And so, in general, they knew something was up. One night, they go to bed. The next morning, they wake up, and it's too late. And they were just stunned. It was if by magic these trenches were put in place, the forts were built, and Washington had these kind of prefab buildings, wooden structures to be put in place with bales of hay, barrels of dirt, and through the night they just worked. And of course he had a distraction. He had his cannons, other cannons that were already in place, cannonading in Boston Neck to kind of suppress the sound of their building on Dorchester. And the next morning, when the British looked up and saw these pre-made forts in place with cannons pointing at them, they were just stunned. They thought it was almost like magic that overnight all of this was put there. And I liked General Howe's quote, "My God, these fellows have done more in one night than I could get my army to do in 3 months." So he had to evacuate. They had a little agreement, sort of a secret deal. Once we started cannonading down into Boston, he knew he had to go. But he was in trouble because it was very hard to load up all the troops and leave when they're being cannonaded. And so he sent a message saying, "Look, I'll make you a deal. I won't burn Boston to the ground if you let me go unmolested." And so that was kind of the under the table deal that they made. So he went up to Canada, but the plan all along, as everybody knew, was New York. They knew they had to take New York and hold that, and then send out troops from that centralized area. So Howe returned to take New York. Washington was going to oppose this, and but Howe was now well reinforced, arrives with 400 ships. His brother, the Admiral Howe, was working with him. 32,000 soldiers, 13,000 sailors, a huge armada brought down to New York. Washington, still rather a new general, trying to organize his troops that are not generally well organized themselves, was outflanked, basically because he didn't send his men out to see all the different areas that could be, the approaches that could be made to his emplacement. He's outflanked and routed, and almost miraculously escapes. How, if he pursued diligently, he most likely could have had Washington at that point, because he had him up against the river, and there was no place to go but to cross the river, and Howe controlled the river with his ships. But one night, Washington tells his men, "Keep the fires burning." You have a number of troops whose sole job is to keep their campfires burning so that it doesn't look like we're leaving. And the rest of them crossed the river and escaped. And apparently the only soldiers, colonists, who were captured were the greedy ones who were trying to loot what was left, and they were captured. But Howe still was not in a great hurry. He felt that he could be generous with Washington, and they would all see that he was not an evil sort of guy just wanting to crush them. There was a smallish sort of battle, Harlem Heights, in September, but the next month, Howe spent in New York trying to just consolidate his gains, and at this point, the famous hanging of Nathan Hale. Washington had sent this young man to gather information on British troop movements, and he was captured. We all know what Nathan Hale said, right? When he was captured and hung. What? Very good, very good. We're not actually sure he said that, but he should have said that. There's a number of things that he did say that people recorded afterwards, and he said something along those lines. That's actually something of a quote from a play Cato, Joseph Addison wrote sometime before, and it was a very famous play amongst the colonists. So another battle, White Plains in October. One of the great losses that just mortified Washington was the taking of the fort named for him that looked impregnable. It was like, look, this is Bunker Hill, only we're well fortified and we have a lot of ammunition. They're never going to take Fort Washington. Well, they did, and captured a whole lot of cannons and supplies and 2,800 prisoners. And there's a statue to Nathan Hale. Back in 1985, the state of Connecticut made Nathan Hale their official hero. Now, I didn't know states had official heroes, but Connecticut has one, and it's Nathan Hale. So, across New Jersey, now that Washington has been kicked out of New York, Howe is going to start setting his plan into taking various parts of the colonists. He sends Clinton to take Newport, Rhode Island, because it's a very good port that can be very useful to the British Navy. He settles into winter quarters because he's kind of done at this point, and sends Cornwallis out to chase Washington. And Washington, as we know, gets away, crosses the Delaware, gathers all the boats along the Delaware River so that he cannot be followed. And at that point, they're saying, okay, it's December and winter's coming on. We all go into winter's quarters. And Washington knew that he was at the end of his rope, knew that he had to do something and do something soon, because the recruits, their time is up at the end of the year. And so this was a desperation move. He crossed the Delaware, captures 900 out of the 1,500 Hessians at Trenton, December 26th. A very strategic day, of course, because the crossing was Christmas night, and all the Hessians, they were hoping would be drunk from their Christmas reveling, and he was somewhat right. And it was a very stormy, windy night, and in the morning when they finally got to Trenton, it was still very windy and sleet, and it was a horrible day to have a battle, which was the perfect day to have a battle for Washington because nobody was expecting it. Also, Princeton, once Cornwallis found out what was happening, he gathers as much troops as he can. The outposts, kind of like the one at Trenton with 1,500 Hessians, there were a few others around in the area. He had to gather them together, chase after Washington, and Washington, uncharacteristically, was actually very nimble at this point and outmaneuvered Cornwallis and caught a baggage train and kind of some soldiers in Princeton and routed them, and then escaped. Here's a famous painting, Crossing the Delaware. Great painting. (1777), the British campaign. Howe wanted to take Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the capital at this point. This is where Congress is, and like many British generals, the strategy is often capture the cities. If you capture the capital, that's almost like winning the whole war. And so, on his way to Philadelphia, he was going to try to maneuver Washington into a battle, see if he can defeat Washington. And Washington was wanting a battle, but going to be very careful about it. Washington set a trap for him at a little town called Brandywine, but again is outflanked. Howe could see his way around the flank of Washington's army, and once again routed him because of it. September 11, 1777, And so Howe enters Philadelphia and occupies it, thinking that this is going to be a great triumph and the Americans are going to soon give up. Congress had to flee, and Howe stays for the winter. Of course, this is the same time that Burgoyne is defeated up in New York, Saratoga. General Howe is under a lot of stress and has for some time wanted to resign. This was very difficult. Being a general, I'm sure, is always very stressful, but he had had enough and he wanted to resign. He sends this letter of resignation in October, and of course he complains that he wasn't supported enough, didn't have enough troops to do the massive job of taking all the colonies. But his resignation was accepted in April of the next year. And he had John Andre, who, as we know, worked with Benedict Arnold. He had a huge going away party. Jousting tournament, fireworks, dancing, and it was said that this party, this going away party for General Howe, cost in our day, it would be somewhere around $700,000. An amazing amount for a going away party. And it was kind of interesting that Peggy Shippen, as we know, Benedict Arnold's future wife, her father, the judge, told her she could not go. She stomped her feet and cried and threw a fit like she generally would. And he kept his foot down and said, "No, you're not going to this party." And because of that, she met Benedict Arnold. Because afterwards, once the British had left and the Americans came back, the women who went to that party were shunned. And they had the list of women who were at this big going away party, and they were all listed as, or they're blacklisted as British sympathizers. So Peggy, because her father put his foot down, was not blacklisted, and so she got to meet Benedict Arnold. Sir Henry Clinton, he's now in charge. Born April 16, 1730, his father was the governor of New York earlier on, served as a militia captain in New York as a young man. And so one of the things I wanted to mention too is that Clinton, when he found that Andre was captured, and he was very upset about it, and this was doubly a bitter stroke for him, because he found out that Andre was captured because he had the plans of West Point on him. Clinton knew West Point inside and out. As a young man, he was a militia captain in New York. He knew West Point. There was no need for Andre to have the plans to West Point. So it was a double blow for him that it was so unnecessary. But of course, for our sake, we're very glad that he did. So anyway, his first military experience was a captain in New York, served in the 7 Years' War in Germany. Now, you notice sometimes I call it 7 Years' War and sometimes the French and Indian War. If we're talking about battles in America, it's the French and Indian War. If we're talking about battles in Europe, it's the 7 Years' War. So he was made a major general and a member of Parliament. Remember, that's MP. 1772. Here's Sir Henry Clinton. So, as I said before, he was there. He had a better plan than Howe to take Bunker Hill, or Breed's Hill, I should say, but it was not used. His strengths were that he had a good mind for strategy and tactics, and sometimes he used them. Other times he did not. So he was ordered to take Charleston, South Carolina, with Cornwallis. Cornwallis just recently arriving in 1776. And that this first attempt failed miserably. So instead of being down in the South, he supported Howe up in New York. And he made himself a nuisance because he had all these great ideas and was constantly telling his superior about them. The two of them did not get along, as many of these generals did not. They always, when you have these huge egos and you're a major general, it's usually because you have some great ideas. And you often do not get along with those who are your superiors because they don't always take them. He was urging Howe to pursue and capture the Americans, Washington especially, and Howe was being way too easy on him. And so he felt quite frustrated. So he's in charge now. He was sent, oh wait, he's not in charge yet. He was sent to capture Newport, Rhode Island. He took a leave of absence, goes to England, and he wanted the northern campaign. He wanted to come down and take the position that Burgoyne eventually did, but he was denied, and another big blow to his ego. And he was going to resign, but the king basically said, no, we still need you, and we're sending you back. And just to make you feel better, I will make you a knight. So you are now Sir Henry Clinton. And that kind of mollified him, made him feel better about himself. So he's now second in charge, second in command, and goes back to America. He knew that it was wrong for Howe not to support Burgoyne. Howe went down to Philadelphia when he should have been going up to Albany in New York to support, and the entire war would have turned out somewhat differently if he had. So ahead of time he was saying, I fear this is a heavy burden on Burgoyne. He was the one who had a small diversionary attempt up the Hudson River. He got up to Kingston, and he sent a little note to Burgoyne in a silver bullet. Sounds very romantic, doesn't it? You put this in a silver bullet, your messenger is carrying it, and the messenger was captured, and so he swallows the silver bullet. That's what he was supposed to do. Of course, he was seen swallowing the silver bullet, so they give him something to give it up. And he immediately gave it up. They opened the silver bullet, and there's a little message in there. Basically, it says, I hope my little diversionary attempt helped you out. And unfortunately for the messenger, he was promptly hung right afterwards because he was a spy. So Clinton becomes commander-in-chief. He takes the army out of Philadelphia and it marches back to New York, because that's really where, as I said, the central place in the colonies at the time, a great harbor, is New York. And so he's going to hold on to New York. That's going to be his main focus. On the way, they fought the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse. It was a great attempt by Washington to save his army. I'm not going to get into that so much today. I'll do this next week when we talk about Washington. But it was a pretty major battle, but it was kind of a stalemate since neither side had, at the end, a great advantage over the other. But it was a very hard-fought battle on both sides. He also, about this time, issues a proclamation to all slaves that if they run away from their masters, that the British will free them. And that caused a lot of consternation amongst the populace. And his strategy was going to be that he was going to hold New York, try to hold the major cities, Newport, Rhode Island, and he was going to send out raiding parties. This was the latest great idea from the crown. The ministers in England say that's kind of what you need to do. You hold on to the major cities and send out raiding parties and wear them down. And so he is now in charge, and his second in command is Cornwallis. And so he takes Cornwallis down to Savannah, Georgia. Actually, this was earlier. They took Savannah, Georgia. Not a huge catch, but it was a strategic location at the southern end of the colonies. And then he takes Cornwallis to capture Charleston, South Carolina, and this time he did it right. He planned it out well in advance. He knew what he should do, and he captured the town with 5,000 soldiers. One of the greatest defeats for the Americans at that point, May of 1780. At this point, he left Cornwallis, goes back up to New York to, again, hold the major city, send out raiding parties, and Cornwallis's job was to subdue the southern colonies. And of course, he didn't leave them with near enough troops. They thought at the time, and it was widely believed amongst the British, that the loyalists, especially in the South, if they were encouraged enough, they would rise up and take control from the patriots. So he goes back to New York, and again, he's always saying he needs more troops, needs more troops. In order to encourage the loyalists, we need to support them, and we need to have more troops to do it. He was a guy who was very high-strung, got stressed out quite a lot. Probably not a good job to be a major general in charge of a huge army if you have stress problems. But not long after he took command, he started asking to be relieved of command. King George wouldn't have it because he didn't think he had any options. Clinton was the most experienced man there, and he felt like he's the only one that can do the job. The French were now fighting on the side of the Americans, and it didn't look good for the British. He's the only one who can still save America, and it didn't even allow him to take leave. You need to be on the job, and you need to take care of this problem. And finally, he didn't get along too well with the admirals. It wasn't Richard Howe anymore. It was another admiral in charge, and they were always bickering about one thing or another. So now I'm going to move on to Cornwallis. He was never the commander-in-chief. He was not the number one guy, but at this point, his actions are far more prevalent than Clinton's. So he was born in 1738. He fought in Germany in the 7 Years' War, several battles, became quite distinguished as a good administrator, a good battle leader, and he became a lieutenant colonel. Here's Charles Cornwallis. He was elected to the House of Commons in 1760, but then his father died in 1763 and he became an earl, so he entered the House of Lords. And curiously enough, he voted against the Stamp Act in the House of Lords. He was only one of 5 in the House of Lords that voted against it. He thought that it was tramping upon the the colonists' rights. And he got married to Jemima Tullikin, 1768. And so here's Jemima Cornwallis. So under Clinton, he arrived, as I said, 1776 to support Clinton first in the failed siege of Charleston, and then he was generally in the major engagements with Washington. It was his division that was taking the lead, whether it's the Battle of Long Island or chasing Washington across New Jersey. It was Cornwallis, his division, that was taking the brunt of it, taking the lead. Trenton and Princeton, he was actually just granted leave and was about to take leave when he found out about Washington's taking of Trenton. So he had to cancel that, gather his troops together, and chase after him, and was actually outmaneuvered by Washington. So here's Trenton and Princeton. Trenton, as we know, he was across the Delaware, crossed over, and had to march something like 9 or 10 miles to Trenton, split his forces to come at it from 2 different directions. And here's Princeton a few days later. I'm not going to get into the details of this tonight. But anyway, there's Trenton and Princeton. And the point really is just that Cornwallis was the guy who was involved with these battles. Brandywine and Germantown, I've mentioned Brandywine. Washington and Howe were maneuvering for Philadelphia. It was Cornwallis's division that outflanked Washington. Howe was basically in charge of that division, but it was Cornwallis's division. Germantown, Washington was repulsed. He should have taken Germantown, but didn't quite do it. And Monmouth, as I mentioned before, Clinton's trying to march his army to New York. Washington caught him, attacked. Cornwallis was the one who led the counterattack against Washington, basically to a standstill. After that, he got leave to go back to England to see his ailing wife, and Jemima, sadly, died in February of 1779. So he comes back with Clinton. He takes Charleston and was left there to subdue the southern colonies with only 3,000 troops. His job mainly was to gather the loyalists to support the British cause and use them as well as his own troops to put down whatever patriot armies were there. He had a very difficult time of it because the Patriots always seemed to have the upper hand. The ships that were supplying his army were often taken out on the seas. The Loyalists were harassed terribly. Small detachments that went out into the countryside outside of Charleston were often attacked. And so he was having a very difficult time of it. He knew that he had to subdue the military efforts of the troops down there, South Carolina. His greatest success was against the hero, the supposed hero of Saratoga in Camden, South Carolina. He actually routed a larger force of Americans. He saw that he had them, about 4,500 American troops, and he only had probably about 2,000 or a little less, and he was going to attack anyway because he felt that the time was right. So leading a great bayonet charge kind of at the end of this, routed the Americans, and so that was a great victory for him. And then, of course, the famous Kings Mountain, where there's only one British officer with a group of loyalists, were utterly defeated, made a very bad mistake. It's capturing or setting up at the top of this hill, Kings Mountain, surrounded by these loyalists, or no, I'm sorry, the Patriots surrounded the loyalists, and they figured that usually it's the smart thing to do to be at the top of a hill and shoot down. But apparently at this particular hill, it was very awkward because of the terrain, the rocks. It was actually more advantageous, and you had an easier shot at the people above you than the people above you shooting down. And so because of that, they were all captured, and the Americans were going to kill them. Some of the soldiers, the patriots, decided that they were going to wipe them all out because of Bannister Tarleton, we'll talk about in a minute, who gave no quarter to some Americans that he had captured. Of course they didn't. They killed some that they shouldn't have, but they captured the whole lot of them. Here's Kings Mountain. They are at the top. They were surrounded, and there were several depictions of the thick woods that surrounded Kings Mountain, and I'm trying to get a picture of how it is that the people going up the hill have a better shot at the people looking down on them, but apparently that was the case. So a couple more battles. Cowpens, Daniel Morgan with 2,000 destroys a detachment of light infantry. This is the infamous Bannister Tarleton. He was outnumbered 2-1, and his small detachment was utterly destroyed. He escaped with about 200 of his soldiers, but that was kind of the end of his raiding. January 1781, Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis. Oh yeah, you know, now I'm getting my battles mixed up.
What state are we in now?
This is Cowpens. This is North Carolina. Or is it South Carolina? South Carolina, sorry. I get mixed up with those. So anyway, Cornwallis.
Guilford Courthouse?
Yes.
It's in northern North Carolina.
Okay, so Guilford is in North Carolina. Okay. So anyway, Cornwallis attacks a larger group of men, and at one point, in the thick of the fighting, it looked like the Americans were about to take over and push the British back, and so Cornwallis decided to fire into a mass of men, and he had the cannons fire into this group. The Americans were about to rout the British, but then as this grape shot started knocking men down right and left, both the British and the Americans, the engagement was separated. The troops were separated, and Cornwallis saved the day by killing some of his own men in that mass.
Oh,
And there's Bannister Tarleton, very dashing man. Yeah, almost ladylike, huh?
yeah.
So Cornwallis is heading north. He goes up into Virginia, seeking loyalists all the way, and he finds them and finds that since he can't support them, they kind of melt away afterwards. Lafayette, once Cornwallis was in Virginia, Lafayette was sent by Washington to kind of keep an eye on him. He wasn't going to engage him in a major battle, but he thought he could harass him enough to cause him some distress. Clinton and Cornwallis this whole time are arguing back and forth about what should be done. Cornwallis kind of wants his own independent command and to do what he wants to do. Clinton's constantly telling him he's doing the wrong thing and that he should be doing something else. And of course, he's not getting the troops that he had asked for. And so they're both very unhappy with each other. But ultimately, Clinton says, look, go to the coast, take a town on the coast, that way you can support and be supported by the British Navy. and the British, of course, being very confident that that would be a good strategy. After all, they have the best navy in the world. What could go wrong? Clinton at this time is under a great amount of stress. He's just stressing out more and more. Once Cornwallis went to Yorktown, heading in that direction, he wasn't sure what Washington was going to do, and Washington kept sending out mixed signals on purpose to mislead him. So that was stressful. He's constantly complaining about not enough troops. Cornwallis is not obeying his orders, and his mistress, of all things, is giving birth. So all of these things are very stressful to the commander-in-chief. And so bad that he suffered blindness on a couple of episodes. Just from the stress, there are bouts of blindness that we know can happen when you're under stress and your mistress is about to give birth. Yeah, that'll do it if nothing else. And so we come to Yorktown. The French admiral, against all expectations, shows up and defeats the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, and now the way is open for Washington to come and surround. Washington, of course, with French support, Rochambeau lay siege, lasted about 3 weeks, and Cornwallis felt he had to surrender. Of course, Clinton, in his book, says that if he would have just held out a little bit longer, I would have rescued him. But that's his story. So this is essentially the end of the war. So what I'm going to do is give the careers post-Revolutionary War of the various generals. So Thomas Gage, when he got back to England, and generally King George was sympathetic to all of his generals. He was not overly critical. And so he wanted to encourage them. Thomas Gage, he got a sympathetic greeting. He remained in the military until his death, but he lived basically at home in London and died 1787. William Howe arrived back in England July 1st, 1778. There was an inquiry by Parliament into his dealings in America at the time. It was pretty much inconclusive. They were not going to reprimand him, but they weren't going to let him off the hook either. They weren't really sure. It was just inconclusive. But he served on the Privy Council to the king. They made him a general again later on to prepare for war against France as that loomed in the 1790s. He became the governor of Plymouth in 1805. His health declined after that point and died July 12, 1814. Henry Clinton was relieved of command early in 1782. He published his defense in a number of publications. Of course, he and Cornwallis kind of went back and forth, trying to convince people that the other one was responsible for the disaster. He became a member of Parliament right off in 1782. And again, he was used to prepare for the French wars in the 1790. He died 1795. Now it's somewhat ironic that the British general most famous for losing the war has the most illustrious career afterwards. So he arrived back in England. He defended himself against Clinton. They had their pamphlet war. He became Governor General and Commander-in-Chief in India, 1785 to 1794, and apparently did a lot of good there as far as the British are concerned. Enacted several reforms to make the government less corrupt and less abusive of the Indian people. became Master of Ordnance, which is basically overseeing military infrastructure, supplies and whatnot, made it more efficient, and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And if you know the policy of Great Britain towards Ireland at this time, you'll know that it's not a good thing when I said he did a very good job. He defeated a French invasion of Ireland, and he subdued the Irish very thoroughly and made them toe the line for Great Britain. So he was celebrated for that, but from our vantage point, we can see it was not something that really should have been done. But that's what he did. He died in India in 1805. He was going to go back and be commander-in-chief again in India, but he died of a fever once he got there. And he is the only one of these generals who has a fantastic monument and a statue to this day. He has, I mean, get a load of this. This is just an amazing statue with a couple of very pretty women at the bottom. And
Where is this?
This is in England. I'm not sure exactly where. I think in London, but I'm not sure. And here is where he's buried. Very nice monument. So yeah, Cornwallis is the most celebrated of the generals in England. So, and I'm not too much over. And yes?
So how did you react to Mel Gibson when he sold his dog?
Mel Gibson, that's good. I'll let that pass. I don't. Yes.
When Cornwallis and others were running around trying to gather loyalists, how did they treat people who weren't really too crazy about being a loyalist, or worse yet, were opposed to being? Did they force anybody into service who was not really interested in doing that?
I don't think they forced anybody who was not a loyalist into service. This was a voluntary thing that the call is for loyalists to come to them to sign up to fight against the rebels. Yes.
Who was the architect of the plan to move the cannons from Ticonderoga to Boston?
That was Henry Knox. I don't know that it was his idea, but he's the one who did it. He's the one who went out there and put the men to work in gathering these cannons and bringing them back. For those of you who don't know anything about Henry Knox, he was a bookseller. And one of the rare instances in which a guy who has almost nothing but book knowledge becomes a military leader and does it very well. Henry Knox is a remarkable, that story, I have a biography on him that talks a lot about the things that he did that were very remarkable as a guy who just knew what he read out of books. And he brought these, it was a fantastic trip from Ticonderoga down to Boston, 300 miles or so, in the dead of winter on these sleighs, and they had to build what they had, to get them down. So, and the crossing of the Delaware, by the way, it was ordered by Washington, but that was carried out by Henry Knox. So he was the artillery officer with Washington throughout the war.
I think Washington ordered Knox to go get cannon.
Yeah, that's probably the case, but it was Henry Knox who performed
He
the
did
deed.
it, yeah.
Yeah. Yes?
Princeton is east of where Washington crossed the Delaware, but somehow he got back if he was going to attack Princeton. How do you do that?
Stay tuned next week. We'll when we talk about Washington. It was one of Washington's finest moments that he could outmaneuver the British, because he generally was not as good as the British at maneuvering. So, anything else? Next week is George Washington.
Okay, thank you.
All right. See you next week. I know, I should have had him as one of them.